Question 93 of Prima Secunda, the Summa Theologica, continues on our treatise in law. This is the eternal law. Now, St. Thomas is going to begin to take each of the types of law one by one. Tomorrow will be natural law, today is eternal law, and eventually the human law and also the divine law as well. This is a very, very important question with 6 articles in it on the eternal law. So I am going to take my time on this one. And before I start, I just want to say that one of the things that I'm endeavoring to do with this channel is to show how the theology and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas fits into the big picture of the history of philosophy. Of course, St. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century, but philosophy really began hundreds of years even before Christ with the pre-Socratics and goes all the way to the modern age. And so along with my deep dive study of St. Thomas Aquinas and particularly the Summa Theologica, I also am spending a lot of time studying the history of philosophy because I really want to put it into context, because it's my opinion that Aquinas got it right. Of course, inspired by divine, the Holy Spirit inspiring him to, I think, to a much bigger degree than many other philosophers were able to receive that kind of inspiration. So let's get into this, and again, I'm going to go a little bit slower on this one, and I'm going to pause a little bit more often and explain things, so bear with me, and if you can hang throughout the entire video, I think you're going to get a lot out of this. Article 1, whether the eternal law is a sovereign type existing in God. A sovereign type. Now, the word type is very important because you can think of type as being an idea or an exemplar, and you might think of Plato and his realm of forms, or different different areas of philosophy might come to mind as you see these words of what St. Thomas is saying here. And this is a beautiful, beautiful article because I really want to spend a little bit of time on this one and go slowly with it so that we can unpack every bit of it. And so he starts in the corpus, and that's all I'm really focusing on in these articles is the corpus, because I can't do the whole thing. It would just take too long. He says, I answer that, just as in every artificer there pre-exists a type of the things that are made by his art. All right, an artificer is just an artist. An artificer is somebody that creates something. So he's saying that when an artist creates, let's say, like a sculpture or a painting, or even an artist, an author writing a book, he's saying it exists in the mind before he does the art. It's already existing in the mind. Okay, that's what he means by that. It's pre-existing, a priori. So too, in every governor, there must pre-exist the type of the order of those things that are to be done by those who are subject to his government. So now, he hasn't really talked about God yet, but he's talked about the artist and what's in his pre-existing in his mind. Now he's talking about the governor. Okay, now he's talking about a ruler, like a secular ruler, or you can even think of a parent. If you're a parent, when you had a child, in your mind, you might have already started to think about how you wanted to raise this child and the rules that you were going to impose and that kind of thing. So it's in the mind before it takes action and becomes a law, so to speak. And just as the type of the things yet to be made by an art is called the art or exemplar of the products of that art, so too the type of him who governs the acts of his subjects bears the character of a law. So again, he's drawing the connection between the artist and the lawmaker, the governor and the artist. And he's going to end up saying, well, God is like both of them, all right? Now God, okay, he's bringing God in now. God, by his wisdom, all right, wisdom, the highest of the intellectual virtues, God doesn't really have wisdom. God is wisdom, okay? But he's using this in language that we can understand. He's saying, he's giving wisdom as like an attribute of God or something that God has, which really isn't the case, but I think we understand what Thomas is getting at. He is the creator of all things in relation to which he stands as the artificer to the products of his art. So God is the artificer. God is an artist. But remember, the things that create, even on a human level, are in the mind before it becomes a reality reality. That's a heavy word, because is it already real in the mind, or is it real when they actually make it? So I'm going to leave that one alone. Okay, moreover, he governs all the acts and movements that are to be found in each single creature. Okay, so now he's getting to now he's comparing God to the governor, the ruler, and the artist, right? Therefore, as the type of the divine wisdom, inasmuch as by it all things are created, now its creator, has the character of an art, exemplar or idea, so the type of divine wisdom. So the words that keep coming up are type, exemplar, wisdom, and now we're going to get into teleology. He's not going to use that word, but he's going to talk about God directing all things to their end, as moving all things to their due end. Okay, there you go. Bears the character of a law. Accordingly, the eternal law is nothing else than the type of divine wisdom, as directing all actions and movements. All right, that is so important. If you understand that not only is God teleologically directing all things to their end, and this should make you think of maybe somebody like Georg Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit, if you've ever learned anything about that, where for Hegel, God is evolving. God is, thinking of thought. And so our concept, the Thomistic concept of God is very different. It's immutable. It's not moving. It's not changing. It's also not pantheistic. Okay, the things out there in the world are of themselves, have their own essence. Okay, so this is why a good history of philosophy comes in very handy, because these kind of things are very important, and many people have gone astray because they haven't stuck to just the basic Christian principles as taught by St. Thomas Aquinas. Article 2, whether the eternal law is known by all. Does everybody in this picture know the eternal law? And now this is interesting, because he's going to give kind of a definition. I often say that the eternal law is basically everything that's true. Okay, if something is true, it's part of the eternal law. Thomas is going to mention this in this article. He says a thing may be known in two ways. First, in itself. Secondly, in its effect, wherein some likeness of that thing is found. Thus, someone not seeing the sun in its substance, there's a big word, substance, okay, sun in the substance, may know it by its rays. Okay, we know the sun by its heat, we know it by its light, but that doesn't mean we know the substance of the sun, right? We know the effects of it. So then, no one can know the eternal law as of in itself except the blessed who see God in his essence. All right, when we, God willing, through God's grace, get to heaven, we will see God in his essence. And this is eschatology, and we won't go too much into that right now. But every rational creature knows the eternal law in its reflection, greater or less. For every knowledge of truth is a kind of reflection and participation of the eternal law. Let me repeat that. That's very important. Every knowledge of truth is a kind of reflection and participation of the eternal law, which is the unchangeable truth, as Augustine says. 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, that's eternal law. The law of gravity, you name it, okay? Anything you learned in school that's true, that's part of the eternal law. So we participate in the eternal law and divine reason just by coming to know truth, which is a part of our reason, right? Our intellect understands reason. That's all the more reason why the theological virtue of faith, which is aligned with the intellect, which is aligned with truth, is so important. That's an infused virtue. Now, all men know the truth to a certain extent, at least to the common principles of the natural law, which we learned a few days ago, but he's going to go into it more tomorrow. As to the others, they partake of the knowledge of truth, some more, some less, and in this respect, they are more or less cognizant of the eternal law. So yes, everybody knows the eternal law, but not everybody knows it to the same degree, because to the degree that we are open to truth, also, as he's going to get at in a few articles here, sin blinds us to the truth. Sin will darken our intellect, and so we're not able to participate in the eternal law as much if we have sin. Article 3, whether every law is derived from the eternal law. So remember, eternal law, divine law, human law, and natural law, are they all based on the divine law, the eternal law? Okay, the law denotes a kind of plan directing acts towards an end, teleology. Now, wherever there are movers ordained to one another, the power of the second mover must needs be derived from the power of the first mover. This one's pretty easy to understand, so I'm going to go through it a little bit more quickly and not stop as often, but this one will probably make a lot of sense to you. Since the second mover does not move except insofar as it is moved by the first. Wherefore, we observe the same in all those who govern, so that the plan of government is derived by secondary governors from the governor in chief. Thus, the plan of what to be done in a state flows from the king's command. Thomas lived in an age when kings were much more common, to his inferior administrators. And again, in things of art, the plan of whatever is to be done by art flows from the chief craftsman to the under craftsmen who work with their hands. Think of the architect who designs a building, and then men go out and they actually do the physical work and they construct it, right? But it started with the architect. It started in his mind designing this. Okay, isn't this great? Since then, the eternal law is the plan of government of the chief governor, God. All the plans of government in the inferior governors must be derived from the eternal law. But these plans of inferior governors are all other laws besides the eternal law. So the other three are all inferior to the eternal law, which is the most important law. Therefore, all laws, insofar as they partake of right reason, are derived from the eternal law. Hence, Augustine says that in temporal law, there is nothing just and lawful but what man has drawn from the eternal law. So any law, if you're a lawyer, or you're a police officer, if you're a judge, laws have to be designed based on the eternal law, right? They have to be true. They have to be, they have to be right, which is a whole other issue because that has to do with justice. But we move on. Article 4. This is very interesting. Whether necessary and eternal things are subject to the eternal law. Well, you should, if you've been watching these videos and you've been studying the Summa, when you see the word necessary and eternal, you should immediately think of God. So he's saying here, is God subject to the eternal law? He's going to conclude that, well, God is the eternal law, right? He's not subject to it, but it's kind of a short paragraph here, so I'll read it. He says, the eternal law is the type of the divine government, as we've already learned. Consequently, whatever is subject to the divine government is subject to the eternal law. While if anything is not subject to the divine government, neither is it subject to the eternal law. The application of this distinction may be gathered by looking around us. Looking around us, that means observing the world, seeing things, noticing birds and human beings and buildings and skies, and all the things that we see help us to understand the eternal law, because it's all part of the eternal law, anything that's true, right? For those things are subject to human government, which can be done by man, but what pertains to the nature of man is not subject to human government. For instance, that he should have soul, hand, or feet. That's an interesting sentence. I'm not going to get too much into that, but these are all parts of our nature. These are parts of our human nature, right? Accordingly, all that is in things created by God, whether it be contingent or necessary, is subject to the eternal law. Okay, that makes sense. Anything out there, whether it be an irrational creature, angels, they're all subject to the eternal law because God is in charge of everything, and everything that's true is part of the eternal law. While things pertaining to the divine nature or essence are not subject to the eternal law, but are the eternal law itself, right? So God is not subject to the eternal law. He is the law. Finally, these last two are a little bit more complicated. He says whether natural contingents are subject to the eternal law. Now, contingents mean that you have a choice. You mean whether or not I, treat my wife well or my kids well, or whether I go to work on Monday on time. Now, those are contingencies. Those are things that have to do with my free will that I can choose to do. Some things I don't choose, some things I can. So that's what he's talking about. Are those part of the eternal law? He says we must speak otherwise of the law of man than of the eternal law, which is the law of God. For the law of man extends only to rational creatures subject to man. The reason of this is because law directs the actions of those things that are subject to the government of someone. Wherefore, properly speaking, none imposes a law on his own actions. Okay, I don't impose a law on myself. The law comes from the outside, right? Now you might say, we do in a sense impose laws on ourselves, but these are not the law that he's talking about here. Now, whatever is done regarding the use of irrational things, okay, irrational creatures, dogs, cats, squirrels, bunnies, subject to man is done by the act of man himself moving these things, for these irrational creatures do not move themselves, but are moved by others. So I think maybe what he's talking about here is like our pet dog, our pet goldfish, our pet cat, I don't know, a tree that we plant, which is irrational. Is that what he's getting at? I don't know. Consequently, man cannot impose laws on irrational beings, however much they may be subject to him, because the irrational things are immediately under the command of God, because they do things through instinct. Although you certainly would have to make an exception and say, well, we do make rules for our dogs. You have to stay in the backyard, you got to eat your food, you got to, but he can impose laws on rational beings subject to him insofar as by his command or pronouncement of any kind, he imprints on their minds a rule which is a principle of action. Okay, think of the boss, think of the governor, think of the parent. Okay, we do impose rules on our rational, subjects, but not on irrational. So I don't entirely understand that, but let's move on. Just as man by such pronouncement impresses a kind of inward principle of action on the man that is subject to him, so God imprints on the whole of nature the principles of its proper actions. And so in this way, God is said to command the whole of nature. All right, so he's comparing our ruling or law-giving of rational creatures under our control to God's law of the entire world. That should give you a different perspective on you and those whom you are in authority over, and also whom you are subject to, right? Like a boss. And thus all actions and movements of the whole of nature are subject to the eternal law. Consequently, irrational creatures are subject to the eternal law through being moved by divine providence. I think this is the first time he's used the word providence, I believe, in these questions, in these articles. But not as rational creatures are through understanding the divine commandment. We understand the divine commandment. We have intellect. We have reason. The dog and the cat and the ant and the squirrel and the snake can't understand it. They just act. They act out of instinct, right? They're not doing it because they're being obedient or they have any kind of choice. Article 6, whether all human affairs are subject to the eternal law. I put some kids playing football or whatever. So all of our actions, everything we do, going to the park and play, going swimming, going to parties, are these all subject to the eternal law? He said there are two ways in which a thing is subject to the eternal law. First, by partaking of the eternal law by way of knowledge. Okay, epistemology, knowledge, very, very important. What do we know? Remember he said in the last article, we can know the commandments. Dogs can't know the commandments because they don't have the ability to abstract. They can't understand ideas. Secondly, by way of action and passion. By partaking of the eternal law by way of an inward motive principle. Okay, I think of David Hume when I think of inward motive principles, passion, emotion, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, the romantic philosophers, the architects of the French Revolution, which was, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I told you I want to bring in other philosophers. I want to connect all this, okay? And of course, Thomas would not have been aware of any of those people because they all came after him, right? And in the second way, irrational creatures are subject to the eternal law. But since the rational nature, together with that which it has in common with all creatures, has something proper to itself, as it is rational. Consequently, it is subject to the eternal law in both ways. What I think he means by this is that we are similar to the animals in that we have instincts. Okay, we just act. We can't help getting hungry or getting sleepy or our sex drive or something like that. That's what we share with the animals. But we have knowledge of the commandments, and so we do have free will. And so that is what's proper to us, and proper means specific to us. Because while each rational creature has some knowledge of the eternal law, it also has a natural inclination to that which is in harmony with the eternal law. We are naturally adapted to the recipients of virtue. And Thomas would say that irrational creatures have virtue with a little v, and that they do what they should, okay? Remember, the virtue makes us good. So you can be a good squirrel, meaning that squirrels are always good because they just do what God gets them to do, and they don't have any free will, right? Okay, last two paragraphs here. Both ways, however, are imperfect and to a certain extent destroyed in the wicked, because in them the natural inclination to virtue is corrupted by vicious habits. Going back to habits. Remember habits? That was the hardest part of the Summa so far. If you remember those videos I did on habits, that was really tough. I mean, that was so confusing. I didn't think habits would be so confusing. And moreover, the natural knowledge of good is darkened by passions and habits of sin. But in the good, both ways are found more perfect, because in them, besides the natural knowledge of good, there is the added knowledge of faith and wisdom, the virtues. All right, wisdom, the highest intellectual virtue. Faith is a theological virtue. It's not the highest, but it is a theological virtue. And again, besides the natural inclination to good, there is the added motive of grace and virtue. Oh my goodness, he is packing so much into here. None of this is going to be possible without grace. Accordingly, the good are perfectly subject to the eternal law, as always acting according to it, whereas the wicked are subject to the eternal law imperfectly as to their actions. Indeed, since both their knowledge of good and their inclination thereto are imperfect. But this imperfection on the part of action is supplied on the part of passion, insofar as they suffer what the eternal law decrees concerning them, according as they fail to act in harmony with that law. Right? So now there's an aspect of punishment, because when we don't act in accord with the eternal law, we fall off. We miss the mark, which is the definition of sin, is missing the mark, right? Hence Augustine says, I esteem that the righteous act according to the eternal law, and out of the just misery of the souls which deserted him, God knew how to furnish the inferior parts of his creation with most suitable laws. I'm going to read that one more time. I know this has been a long video, but I want to read that one more time. Augustine says, I esteem that the righteous act according to the eternal law. I esteem that the righteous act according to the eternal law. And out of the just misery of the souls which deserted him, God knew how to furnish the inferior parts of his creation with the most suitable laws. The inferior part of his creation, I think, are the irrational creatures. It's our lower part, that part of us that is instinctual, right? But then the beauty and also the riskiness and the danger of being a human person is that we have free will. Okay, we can know the law, we can disobey it, we can go off track. And that is why we, unlike your dog or your pet goldfish, can end up in hell. All right, I really enjoyed this one, the eternal law. I hope you did as well. Thank you for joining me. Tomorrow is natural law. And then we're going to get into human law. We're going to get into divine law. So this is a really important part of the Summa. And thank you for joining me. God bless you. And St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.